So thank you for joining me. My name is Kimberly McMahon. I am a meteorologist with the National Weather Service in Burlington, Vermont office, and welcome to our 5-year anniversary webinar on Tropical Cyclone Irene. It's going to be about a half hour long, and all your phones are muted. I'll answer a few questions at the end of the presentation, and we are recording. So basically we're going to cover a brief history of tropical cyclones that have impacted the North Country, not go too in depth on that because I do want to get into more of what happened with Irene. Then we're going to go into the timeline of Irene's development and its track, then the impacts that Irene caused in the North Country, especially with the river flooding that you should all be familiar with. So taking a look, there's this great site, and you can see the source is the coast.noaa.gov hurricanes, and you can see the tracks of historical hurricane tracks. For this search, I did within 200 nautical miles of Burlington, Vermont, because it is pretty much the center point of our morning forecast area. So since 1858 to 2015, there's been 65 storms that have passed within the 200 nautical miles. And you can kind of make out that Irene is this white boldish line. So a lot of hurricanes have affected the North Country in the past. Of note, there were 12 that had similar tracks to Irene. So what I mean by that is basically started in the Atlantic Basin or the Mid-Atlantic and then tracked past the Antilles and towards Florida, but then hooked northwards and went over the Carolinas and then towards New England. You may know some of these, like Donna in 1960, Doria in 1971, Gloria in 1985, Bertha in 1996, and Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Now, being that Hurricane Floyd was the most recent to have a similar track to Irene, I have a map showing Floyd's track from 1999 plotted in blue in comparison to Irene's track from 2011 plotted in red. And you can see that they both started in the Atlantic as opposed to the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea, and traveled basically west to northwestward, then hooked northward through the Carolinas and up towards New England. Irene took a more northerly track, as you can see on the red line, straddling the New York-New England border and then into Vermont. Meanwhile, Floyd took a more northeasterly track going along the coast of Maine. One of the big differences between Floyd and Hurricane Irene was that in 2011, we had already seen numerous flooding events. So we were running about 10 inches above normal for the yearly precipitation at Burlington. So the ground was moist, the soils were moist, and river levels were already running abnormally high. If you remember, we had a lot of spring flooding that occurred with the snowmelt and heavy rain. So now I'm going to move on to a recap of Irene's track and evolution. A couple of things to keep in mind. I'll be referring to the category type based on the Saffir-Simpson scale. When I do, I will try to remember to also state the wind speed that occurred, so that way you don't have to memorize this little chart on the bottom left. So in the early days of Irene, August 15th, there was a vigorous or strong tropical wave off the coast of Africa near the Cape Verde Islands, if you happen to know where that is, and it was tracking pretty much westward. By the 20th, there was a reconnaissance aircraft that was sent out and observed 50-mile-per-hour winds, or 43 knots, and enough of a closed circulation that it was named a tropical storm. And Tropical Storm Irene because it was the ninth named storm of that season. So on the 20th, just 5 days after identification as a strong wave, it was named as a tropical storm. And on the bottom left, you can see the first forecast track that the National Hurricane Center put out, and mostly a westerly, slightly hooking northwest track, pretty much affecting the Antilles Islands and going towards the Caribbean. By the 21st and 22nd, we have this plot of the track of Irene as well as the times and the categories. So on the 21st, the night of the 21st, going into the morning of the 22nd, Hurricane Irene made landfall in the Antilles Islands and strengthened to a Category 1 as it crossed over Puerto Rico on the 22nd. Irene continued a pretty much west-northwest track, and as it was moving away from the northern coast of Hispaniola, which is this island here with Haiti, Irene actually strengthened to a Category 2 for a brief period of time on the 24th, but then strengthened into a Category 3 very quickly after that. So moving on, the wind speeds were about 120 miles per hour as a Category 3. When we get to the 24th and 25th, which is indicated by that circle I just drew there, and specifically that circle with the white around it, you can notice that Irene started to take a more northerly track, and that would be due to the fact that at the mid-levels of the atmosphere there was a trough. So if you take a look at the image on the top left, you can see this kind of dip in those bars. So basically this low pressure area or trough had an impact on Irene's steering flow. So as the air around the trough basically moves this way, it forces Irene, or it affected Irene to take a more northerly track as opposed to going or continuing northwesterly. And on the bottom left, you can see in a satellite imagery on the 25th, 1215Z, which is basically 8:15 in the morning, and that's right about when Irene was starting to make a move more northward as opposed to northwest. So while that was going on, back in the North Country, we saw that the National Hurricane Center had issued an update to Irene's track and forecasting Irene to go and affect the Outer Banks of North Carolina on Saturday and start to reach the northeast United States come Sunday. So our office, National Weather Service in Burlington, issued a flash flood watch that was issued 42 hours before the first report of flooding we received, and we also issued a high wind watch 43 hours before the strong winds arrived. Now, nearly 5 days prior to Irene's arrival on the 28th, these forecasts, along with the work and collaboration that we did with government officials, both federal, state, and local, allowed huge jumps in preparation. The New York State Emergency Operations Center was activated on the 24th. We had briefed governor and state officials to expect power outages, flooding, and potential wind damage, or at least strong winds. There was a state of emergency that was declared in Vermont on August 27th with 24-hour staffing at Vermont's emergency management offices. Utility companies were able to bump up their staffing, and the Champlain Valley Fair closed in advance of the storm so that people would stay home and stay safe, or at least not try to get to the fair in hazardous conditions. So come the 26th and 27th, Irene was bearing down on North Carolina, and you can see the Outer Banks over here, and Irene made landfall at Cape Lookout in North Carolina, and unfortunately there was 10 to 15 inches of rainfall in that area, and that was with Irene weakening to a Category 1, which was about 86 mile per hour winds or 75 knots. The flow around a hurricane is counterclockwise, so we had a lot of wind pushing water into the Outer Banks, which are just basically barrier islands, so they suffered 2 to 7 feet of storm surge on top of the 10 to 15 inches of rainfall they were receiving. Meanwhile, in the North Country, if you look at the top graphic on the right-hand side, we had high pressure over us. So mostly clear skies, no winds, very fair weather conditions. And that was the morning of the 26th. By the 27th, you can see that Irene is already on top of the Carolinas, and on the 27th in the North Country, we're still experiencing fair weather. So that adds a challenge for us as meteorologists and forecasters to warn everybody about the imminent hazardous weather, the dangers that would be arriving with Irene. Meanwhile, at the time, you look outside and it's gorgeous, beautiful weather. So just one of the challenges that we face, trying to make sure that everybody's aware of the inclement weather that is soon to arrive. On the 28th, Irene actually made landfall twice. Now, looking at the track, you can see that again, she made landfall in New Jersey, and then New York City area, while weakening, but still a Category 1 with 69 mile per hour winds or 60 knots. And at this time, rain was already spreading into the North Country from south to north the evening of the 27th and throughout the day on the 28th. By mid-morning on the 28th, we had already issued flash flood warnings for Rutland and Windsor counties. I apologize for the spelling mistake there. And we did wind up issuing more flash flood warnings throughout the day on the 28th. Here we have an infrared satellite loop, and basically infrared is the measurement of the temperature of cloud tops. So the blues and the reddish purples indicate very cold cloud tops, which means very deep cloud layers, very moist conditions, as you would expect with a tropical system. But a couple of things to note, and I'm not going to write on the loop because it'll get in the way of each additional image, but notice how most of the moisture, most of these clouds, these cold, deep clouds, are actually ahead of the low pressure center. And it's a little hard to see because it's white isobars on top of grayish white clouds. But here's the low pressure track, and all that blue and even the yellowish green is out ahead of it. So a lot of the rain and moisture was moving far ahead of the actual low pressure center. Another thing to note is just the size of this cloud shield, including the clouds down on the southern side of the low pressure center, which is more of that gray tone. But at one point, Irene was 500 miles across or in diameter, so a very, very large system. And you can see that there's also some of these bands in the colors. So you can see there's like blue, then a patch of yellow, then another patch of blue. And that is indicative of heavy rainfall that's occurring within those bands. Taking a closer look into the track of Irene over our area, by 8 a.m. on the 28th, the winds were 75 miles per hour and crossing from New Jersey into New York. But by that point, Vermont and northern New York were already seeing rainfall. An hour and a half after Irene is in that position 1, which is Category 1 hurricane, we had our first report of flash flooding in Rutland County at 9:30 a.m. So, you know, the low pressure center was still far away. If you look, you know, there's Rutland, for example, and around that time, Irene was still down in the New York City metro area. By noon, highways were impassable and evacuations and rescues were ongoing. Meanwhile, Irene is still over southern New York going into Connecticut around noon. So a lot of damage that corresponded to all that moisture and heavy rain being out ahead of the low pressure center. Something that made Irene very hazardous and have a lot of impacts and heavy rainfall over our area is the local effects of the terrain. And I want you to keep this in mind as next couple of slides there'll be a radar loop. Now, remembering that the flow around low pressure centers are generally counterclockwise. So as the wind flows and pushes air across Vermont and northern New York, basically kind of depending exactly where the low pressure center was at the time, but it forced air into the terrain of the Green Mountains and then hooking around over the Adirondacks as well. So this caused upslope, and you may be familiar with upslope flow when we have snowstorms. So usually with the snowstorms, we have the winds coming in from the northwest and butting up against the terrain. But with Irene, we had the winds coming from the east, southeast, and then eventually when Irene was starting to exit from the north, causing the air to butt up against the mountains on mostly the eastern and then the northeastern sides, and the air gets pushed up and lifted because it has no place to go. It can't go down. The mountains are in the way. It gets lifted, and then this squeezes out more moisture or enhances the rainfall as is forced up and lifted over the terrain. So try to keep that in mind as we look at this radar loop. And a couple of things, I'm going to let it play over a few times, but you can see the orange is the really heavy rainfall, and you can see all of this moisture out ahead of the L that's moving up, tracking up. That's the low pressure center of Irene. It's all out ahead and in front of it. By the evening of the 27th, we were already getting rainfall into the area. By the morning of the 28th, there were heavy bands, and these heavy bands of rainfall, you can really see as we go through the loop one more time. If you take a look at Essex County, where that KSLK is in New York, you can see that basically once the rain moves into that area, because of how the wind is flowing around it, the orange stays over Essex County for almost the entire time. And this led to very high rainfall amounts, as we'll see in the following slides. Before I get to the rainfall amounts and unfortunately the damage that came with Irene, I want to show the overall life cycle of Irene via satellite imagery from NASA, and this is August 21st through the 29th. So out in the Caribbean, tracking over Puerto Rico, and now this is Hispaniola that Irene is tracking north of. You can overall see a pretty much west or northwesterly track, and bands within the satellite imagery. It's not as sharp as I would like, but you can also see at times the clear, distinct eye of Hurricane Irene. Now, as we get towards the 26th, and I know it doesn't have the dates on there, but you will notice that Irene starts making that turn more northerly, tracking off the coast of Florida, so never actually making landfall in Florida, and slowly approaching the Carolinas. And about here is where the Carolinas are. You can see also the nice cyclonic flow of most of the clouds, but then the very top of the clouds actually have an anticyclonic flow, as it's at the very, very top of Irene. And it's a little hard to tell, but down here is the Outer Banks, there's Delaware, and there's Irene starting to weaken as it moves over New England. And if you're interested, this is the URL. Of course, we will, like I said, we're recording this, so you can always write that down later when we post this on YouTube. So Irene affected much of the East Coast, especially with its heavy rainfall. The maximum amount recorded was 15.74 inches in North Carolina. So you can see a lot of the purples and even that bluish area. That's where the maximum rainfall occurred. We did have a lot of rain over our area, but I guess our saving grace, so to speak, is that Irene had accelerated in speed as opposed to when it was, or compared to when it was moving over North Carolina. So if Irene had been moving slower, it would have affected us for longer, and therefore we would have had even more rainfall, which would have been even more catastrophic. That being said, in Vermont, there were 2,400 roads, 800 buildings, and 300 bridges that were damaged in record flash flooding. New York, specifically in the Catskills, there were 3 towns that became uninhabitable due to the catastrophic flooding. There was also millions of dollars in damage on Long Island, New York, due to the storm surge and erosion to beaches. New York and Pennsylvania also had record flooding on many of the rivers, as they also had 5+ inches of rainfall in areas. And North Carolina had the 2 to 7 feet of storm surge that I mentioned earlier on the Outer Banks, as well as some widespread home and tree damage inland due to the stronger winds that affected North Carolina. Taking a closer look, you can see the line, the big thick black line, which is the track of Irene, and then in areas, you can see I mentioned the uplift or upslope that occurred and caused heavier rainfall amounts. So if you imagine that the wind was coming pretty much out of the east, bumping up against the Green Mountains and causing those areas of 7 or more inches right along generally the spine of the Greens. And then again, as Irene was centered here, the wind started moving out of the northwest or north, depending on exactly what time it was, and caused about 7 inches or more to fall over the Adirondacks. The St. Lawrence Valley and areas more to the west were further removed, so they only saw about 1 to 2 inches, and the greatest report we received was from South Lincoln, Vermont, with 8.15 inches. Which all that water had to go somewhere. And looking at the river flooding, this is in the Winooski Basin. The red line is our river gauge at Essex Junction on the Winooski River. The green line is the Winooski River in Montpelier, and then the purple river, the purple line is the Dog River in Northfield Falls, and that blue line is the Mad River in Moortown. So the stars are the flood stages, and you can see that early on the 28th, the 12:00 is actually UTC time, so that's 8 a.m. So in the first half of the day, the Dog and the Mad River already reached their flood stages and were continuing to rise. Shortly after that, the Winooski and Montpelier flooded, and at Essex Junction, because it's further downstream in the main stem river, it does take a little longer for the Winooski at Essex Junction to react, but that too come the evening of the 28th into the morning of the 29th, reach flood stage and continue to rise. And as you can see, all of these rivers went past their flood stage. So taking a closer look, in case you are unaware of where these river gauges are, plus a couple extra ones, the Mad River is up in Moortown over here, the Dog River in Northfield Falls, not too far away. And then taking a look at Putnam Creek at Crown Point. So the Mad River is this hydrograph up on the top left, and basically it's just measuring the stage of the river flow, and you can see that all of these gauges got into the purplish pinkish area, which is major flood stage, and actually we lost our river gauge at the Dog River on the bottom left. You can see that there's just a big straight line, which indicates that we lost the observations once it reached that 12.26. So unfortunately, many rivers did flood, make it into major flood stage, and some record flood stage. Looking here at the east branch of the AuSable at AuSable Forks, and then at the Otter Creek in Center Rutland. One thing to note, not only did they make it into major flood stage, but most of the gauges that actually set a record during Irene were not around or did not exist during the November 1927 flood. So for many of the gauges that are longer term gauges, have a longer period of record, their record flood stage is still the November 1927 flood. The ones that tended to reach a record or surpass or create a new record during Irene are younger gauges, don't have as long of a period of record. So as we continue to look at the damage that Irene caused, on the left-hand side we have a satellite image of the Champlain Valley, circled in yellow, and the Otter Creek, circled in blue. And honestly, if you didn't know where the Otter Creek was, it's hard to discern within that blue circle, but a good indication is to start at Rutland, and that was taken before Irene arrived on August 20th, and then days afterwards on August 30th. This is the clearest picture we could get with not too many clouds in the way. You can see all the erosion that occurred and the muddy waters in the Champlain, Lake Champlain, again on the right-hand side in the yellow, and then in blue you can see that the Otter Creek is much more discernible with all the erosion that occurred and the muddy water that is in that area. Looking further east, taking a look at near North Springfield Reservoir, you can see on the top left, this is a satellite image all the way back from 2009, but comparing the two, you can see that the reservoir, generally that dark area is where the water is, and then if you look to the left, that Saunton Pond, and taking a look at the bottom right image, you can see all the water that wound up moving into that area, along with the fact that it's quite muddy and brownish compared to the dark blue in previous or in the previous satellite image. So lots and lots of water. Later on in September, after Irene had moved through and the area was starting to recover, this is the reservoir. On the bottom, there's a picture of the dam, and that's the top of the dam over there, and you can see the mud line of how high the water got. So many, many feet, and you can see that it's over, looking at the top right image, goes more than just around where the water is now, goes into that area of dry land there on the left-hand side of that image. So it gives you a good idea of how high the water actually got. Irene is considered the second greatest natural disaster in Vermont during the 20th and 21st centuries, and again, it's only second to that November 1927 flood. Unfortunately, there were 5 deaths that occurred due to the rainfall-induced flooding across northern New York and Vermont, and you can see many of the images of damage that we'll continue to look at in the next couple of slides. There were 6 bridges that were completely washed away, including historic covered bridges in Quechee and Windsor, Vermont. At the height of the storm, about 50,000 customers were without power, and that's just across Vermont. Train tracks were also washed out in Northfield and Rutland. Power lines and fiber optic cables were cut. There's note of leaking propane tanks that were seen flowing down the Ottaquechee River in Woodstock, where the river was about 10 feet over its banks. So not a storm that we'll forget anytime soon. And you can see on this map all the road damage and road closures that occurred due to the flooding and the heavy rains from Irene. As a result, because of the fatalities and the damage, the name Irene as a hurricane has been retired. The World Meteorological Organization has a committee that decides that. Aside from the 5 deaths that occurred in the North Country, there were 40 in the U.S. total, 3 in Haiti and 5 in the Dominican Republic. Not to mention there was almost $16 billion estimated in damage in the United States alone.